My name is Katerina Gregos.
My name is Deborah Najar.
And actually, this shouldn't be called a walkie-talkie. It should be called a blind date, because we just met. And
Will we date again? Will we go for a second one?
I think we're going to date again for sure. And Deborah and I had a look through the fair, and we've selected three artistic positions each.
And we've retoured them together and agreed that we liked each other's artistic positions. So it's a good start.
Because we weren't sure that's going to happen in the beginning. But anyway, so maybe you want to say a couple of words about yourself before I...
Sure. So my name is Deborah Najar. 3 years ago, I opened a contemporary arts foundation in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates at Al Serkal Avenue. It's the arts hub in Dubai, and I invite you all to visit the UAE. We show Western abstraction, so in the Middle East, and the foundation is very much focused on education, a lot of guided tours, and trying to really bring this abstraction into the Middle East and exchange with the beautiful art scene that there is over there. My collecting is now focused on contemporary artists, very much inscribed in the lineage of minimalist artists that basically I grew up with and we have in the foundation. And Artissima has been an incredible discovery. It's my first time here, and my selection will be artists that I've pretty much discovered here at the fair, and I'm very excited to share them with you all, but especially with you, Katerina.
Thank you. And I'm, Katerina, I'm originally from Athens, but living in Brussels the last 12 years. And I come from a different spectrum, which I think is really nice because we complement each other. So I'm mostly coming from the world of biennials and large-scale exhibitions funded by public money, and recently I curated the first Riga Biennial. And so I've selected three things that I didn't know before, so I kind of plunging into the deep end rather than going down the road of the tried and tested. So I selected three things that I found very exciting, and I'll just very briefly say it's three different generations of artists. An artist born in 1932 from East Germany, two Russian architect artists, visionary architect artists born in 1955, and one young Hungarian artist born in 1980. Now, I don't know whether I've been influenced by my time in Riga, but in retrospect I realized that they all come from Eastern Europe, but that was not intentional.
But it's a fantastic selection. My selection is one young American artist at the very beginning of her career, and you'll see she effectively paints using mixtures of silk, self-woven wool, very beautiful, delicate work. The second artist I discovered at Manifesta, which you have curated in the past.
Yes, I have.
And is from Palermo. He's formerly an engineer, and again we'll discover his work together. And finally, back to my home ground of Dubai, we will go and see a collective of three Iranian artists who have very strong comments to make about the political situation. That is how they came to be in Dubai as opposed to in their home country.
Okay, let's hit the road.
Let's go.
Okay, follow us. Ruth was born in the former GDR in 1932, and she was one of the proponents of mail art. I'm assuming that everyone knows the mail art movement that started in the United States in the 1940s, but was actually reached its sort of apogee in the 60s and 70s and indeed the 80s, so before digital times. And Ruth's work is actually, it falls in the boundary between concrete poetry and visual poetry. And you can imagine that, you know, being behind the Iron Curtain in the 1970s and in the 1960s, where, you know, you were not able to express yourself in a way that artists should. And one of the ways to communicate with the outer world was actually through mail art. And through mail art, artists actually sort of made a variety of different drawings, designs, postcards, letters, what have you, and they were mailing them out to friends. So in fact, this was the only art form that was kind of crossing boundaries and was actually a form of international art practice at the time. And apart from that, Ruth was developing a series of typewritings. There's lots of things happening here. This is not poetry in the traditional sense of the word. It's not sort of poetry that follows a sort of linear narrative, but it's a play with words. It's a concrete play with words. So, for example, it's also about construction. It's about building. It's about building forms, about building volumes, about building spaces. And the ones that I really like here, it says intraverse arrangement. So you're supposed to read these from the outside to the in, and then you'll see that there's different words that branch out. So there's all these plays with like letters and shapes, and some of it, one shouldn't be looking for semantic meaning, but it's more about construction and using language and text to build images and to build a sense of play. And you can read different things into them. I quite like the ones that are also a little bit more abstract. This is playing with the three different ways of saying sign, signum, and this I would say is kind of more constructivist. It's sort of building up volumes and intimating spaces. And what I find extraordinary that it's done with great imagination, with very, very minimal means. These are some of the additions that she made, and she kept a very, very strict log of all the people she was actually exchanging mail art with. And these are, of course, this is her system of classification of all the mail art that she was sending out. Another reason that I selected this, because I find it, of course, interesting art historically and also in relation to the development of concrete and visual poetry, is that, of course, letters have disappeared. We don't write anymore. We don't exchange postcards. We don't exchange letters, which I think are really valuable. And I think we both come from that interim generation where we actually remember what it meant like to wait for a postcard or a letter. And so in a way, it's a kind of very obsolete art form. And to finish, maybe a comment on the art market. One of the reasons for mail art, and particularly mail art that was practiced out of the GDR, was that they actually were against the market. And this was a kind of art that wasn't supposed to be commodified. And of course, as we all know, everything reaches the market. So here it is, but it's still as wonderful as it was, and I find it really inventive and surprising.
It comes to my mind, you've said mail art, and it resonates to me that all my references to mail art are actually male. And she is female, and that sort of gives me that beautiful sort of off-balance insight. So I love this discovery. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And indeed, this is a very good comment, because her husband was also an artist and perhaps more well-known than her. But it so happened, I think, with so many women that were part of this generation that was born at the beginning of the 20th century. So let's move. And this one here is Alexandra Brodsky and Ilya Utkin. So these are two architects, were born in 1955 during the Soviet Union, but started making collaborative works together during the 1980s, just before Glasnost and Perestroika. And of course, the context here is really important. They form part of a sort of movement called paper architecture, paper architects, and that is because they never built anything. All this is imaginary architecture, and the reason I selected it is because I find it quite fascinating, both in terms of the imagination. For example, this work here, Columbarium Habitabile, is a kind of, let's say, future museum of domestic housing, which obviously is not possible at the moment for various reasons, but one can imagine. And this looks very antique. It's etching. I mean, it's extremely detailed. It looks as though it actually comes from the past, but actually it talks very much about the present and the future. And there are a lot of references here from Piranesi, who I'm sure you all know, and visionary architects like Ledoux and Boulet, but down to Le Corbusier. And of course, it was a reaction to the Soviet idea of architecture from the beginning of the 20th century, which started, of course, with modernism and classicism, and then was actually replaced by socialist realism and Stalinism. And both of these guys rebelled against it. But even though these works were actually made in the 80s, I think they're extremely, extremely relevant today because they also have a very social and humanistic dimension. And if you come up close, for example, this work here, for those who are tired of plastic vanity, for those who feel sick of foam rubber life, for those who believe in heavy things that are difficult to move. So, of course, this can be taken as an environmental comment, but it can be also taken as a desire for solidity and stability in the digital era. And where are we? There's one more this is Villa Claustrophobia, which is actually about solitude and isolation. And to me, it sort of reminded me of the isolation that is somehow kind of, engendered by, being glued to the computer behind the screen. And this is a beautiful text too. This is the Forum of 1,000 Truths, the intelligent market. And it talks about the impossibility of knowledge, how money can't buy everything. And it says, the real information can't be bought. It is accessible to those who can watch, listen, think. It is dispensed everywhere, in each spot, crack, stone, pool. A word in friendly conversation gives more than all computers in the world. And this was made in the 1980s.
This is a gallery and an artist that I was very fortunate to discover this year at Manifesta, which, as many of you know, took place in Palermo. And it was, I think, really a beautiful addition in how it integrated so beautifully the city, but also the migration issues. Palermo and Sicily, indeed, are at the crossroads of Africa and Europe. The curators did an incredible job around the Manifesta. Now, one of the big discoveries was the botanical gardens, of course, and the artist that I wanted to introduce you to, literally, because he's actually on the booth, works in Palermo, is from Palermo, was trained as an engineer, and has a very diverse practice. He's and this is his wonderful gallerist, Francesco Pantaleone. Has a very, I was speaking about Ignazio Mortellaro, a very diverse practice coming from an engineering background, and he has documented very attentively not only the shifts in landscape and the evolution of his hometown and his island, but has moved on to a very diverse practice, which I find infinitely interesting, but also diverse. And so here at the booth in Artissima, there are 3 sculptures, and at this point I would be so happy if Francesco would describe them to you, because I think he will do a brilliant job.
I would be more happy if Ignazio do it.
So
even better.
3 pieces coming from an exhibition that is now on view in Palermo and Botanical Garden for Manifesta. This is like a biennale, international biennale in Palermo. The exhibition is È già sono deserto, that in English is I'm already desert, and it's all about time and what we feel about this physic variable. And these 3 pieces are titled Bis and Abyss, Time and Eternity, and Nothing and All. And basically is like a stalagmite that of bronze with the brass stripes, a snake of brass, and Atlas and Epistropheus, that are the 2 cervical vertebrae, the first 2 that help us to turn our head. And the work is about our movement, our transformation, and so that we change from a composition that is basically composed from thoughts and body. This is the last part that joins the head with the body, and we become like something like a landscape, and so we feel like this grain or the desert, like this objectification of us. And so we become an architecture. The stalagmite is something that is dropping in a cave, and slowly the water, like a time machine, make this column. And we are, in a way, part of this big landscape that surround us. And for example, these are thousands of years to grow, and this is 100 years. And this is a wax, lost wax cast of bronze, and this part is brass but handmade, by me, and so it's like what we do every day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I really want to add, as a collector, in discovering artists, I do like to take my time. And an artist with a depth like Ignazio, who is taking into account so many different factors and whose practice is so diverse, I'm glad you had the opportunity to hear him, because this is really one part of his huge practice, and there's a lot to dig into. This booth is a solo booth for a very young American artist. Her name is Martha Tuttle. She graduated with her MFA from Yale in 2015. And it's an art writer friend who made me discover her work. And I've always find it very interesting when an artist's work cannot be photographed accurately, and in a way, yeah, maybe very good art shouldn't be photographed properly, certainly cannot give off the same emotion. So Martha works out of New York, and she is, as Katerina, you described it, she paints with textile. And so these works are very recent, they're from 2018. And if you come closer, I think it's very interesting to see the work, because she weaves the wool herself and then works with natural pigments to dye them progressively. And of course, indigo pigment, these are all natural pigments. They're a result of oxidation, and depending on how long and how many times you dip the fabric in, the dye will settle. So it's a very natural, very subtle process, and one that she does entirely herself. It's in a way a meditative act, but there's also a very structural element to it, in that the frame is then on occasions broken down with another wooden beam coming through, and that's sort of, it's in a response as well to minimalism, which is her influence. But of course, as you know, minimalists didn't want to leave their trace in their works, and so Martha is in the following of that, but in response to as well. Also notice on the floor the pebbles and stones, and she's very interested in nature. Martha grew up in south of the US, and so picking up stones and casting them. So there's a mixture of natural and metal cast of the stones, which you then see again reflected in the paintings where the stones are installed. So very beautiful, to me, very elegant work. Do come up close. There are some new sculptures here as well. They are actually alabaster, and the way that she herself has cut and polished the alabaster gives a result that's almost skin-like. And Martha has just had a beautiful show here in Torino at LUCE Gallery, and thank you for bringing her to Artissima for us. I don't know, maybe Katerina, did you want to?
I actually have a question, because I discovered this work because of you. I have to say I didn't know, and then you told me that it's the daughter of Richard Tuttle, very famous artist.
And of a poet. Yes. Her mother is a poet who has influenced her tremendously.
And I said to Deborah, I'm not a huge painting person myself, but I found this work really beautiful and actually original, and it's not really easy to make original painting today. But I have just one question. The blue hues and the blue color, is that always the way she works, or is it just this specific body of work?
Interestingly, I asked her that, and I speak under your custody, but she uses a variety of colors, but always natural colors. But the indigo, the way that the indigo dyes the fabric is very interesting to her, and how you can indeed evolve with the indigo as you continue to use it. And indigo is created by the oxidization when the fabric comes out of the dip. And so that to her is a very beautiful process. The irregularities, by the way, in the works you'll see in the way she spins and then weaves the wool. The irregularities she completely embraces, of course, because they really illustrate that moment in the process. They are very long to make, by the way. So again, there's a very beautiful poetic feel to them, which to me transpires.
And it's always organic material.
Always, absolutely, exactly. Everything is natural, comes from New Mexico, from nature.
So we're moving to a new gallery glass house gallery, that the whole art scene in Hungary has actually been completely transformed since Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party came to power. And what happened is, as you might know, there are several rather important institutions in Budapest, such as the Ludwig Museum or the Kunsthalle Muxarnok, and following Orban's sort of seizure of power, what he proceeded to do is he removed all of the art professionals from their posts, because they were, of course, institutional framework in Hungary has been completely hollowed out, and you have to be a mouthpiece of the government if you want to have a public post in a museum. And so I was walking down the pink aisle yesterday and I bumped into somebody I know who actually ran a museum and is one of Hungary's top curators, Barnabas Bencsik, who also instigated the Off Biennial, which was the first biennial that happened sort of in a way in reaction to the Orban government. And lo and behold, I mean, as it's not possible to him, for him to have a career in Hungary as a curator anymore, he opened a gallery, which I think is incredibly fortuitous because he has enormous experience and a wonderful eye. And indeed, I stumbled upon his gallery not knowing that he had opened it. And I discovered this artist, this young Hungarian artist called Peter Puklus, who is kind of difficult to describe because I want to call him a photographer, but he's actually not a photographer. He's an artist working in the expanded field of photography. And as Deborah actually suggested, somebody who's working in the expanded field of painting, painting without paint, what Peter is doing is he's actually working in a very constructivist manner. So this work here, I mean, he works in bodies of works and he also makes artist books, and I'm terrible with titles. So this is called The Hero Mother, How to Build a House. So it looks all rather abstract, but it does have a narrative which is slightly codified. But the idea is that this is a tribute to family life. It's a very personal work. It's a tribute to motherhood, but also the challenges of fatherhood. So in these pictures here, you can see the artist, Peter, with his son. You can see his other child here, and you can see also the elements of construction, of building. Building as a metaphor for, of course, an artist also builds worlds, builds universes, but you know, he's also looking into the male stereotype as, you know, the father as the bastion of the house, the one who has to build the home and keep the home. And the way in which these photographs are actually constructed is, it's in a way it's almost kind of very DIY studio photography. He sets up situations and he actually photographs himself, and then he creates these kind of universes. And of course you can read your own references in them, because there's obviously some recognizable objects like Lego here. This is a kind of portrait of him, but he's actually posing as someone else. And of course there's a lot of kind of, you know, stereotypes of the Eastern European male as a kind of master builder, and a lot of kind of hidden references to Eastern European history. And so here you can see actually some of the sculptures that he makes or he finds or puts together as assemblages, for example. And this one I find particularly moving because it's a book. And Barnabas Bencsik, the gallerist, maybe...
Yeah, it's the book of Ivan Turgenev, the famous Russian novelist. And the title is Fathers and Sons. And he used this old copy of the book to put his 9 kind of guidelines to his fatherhood policy. So it's security, tranquility, to be positive, fair, empathic, consistent, love, happiness, and presence. So that's what he would like to use in his position as a father. So it's kind of the 10 what's this? 10 order in the 10 commandments,
Yeah.
but it's a 9 for his personal fatherhood.
So I actually found this work incredible for several reasons. First of all, because it's a really inventive look at photography and how to actually create images with a camera, but that don't only start with the camera and film exposure. Second of all, I find it really playful, and I also like this kind of childlike universe that it creates. This is, for example, father and son. So there's a lot of like beautiful visual metaphors in here. This is a monument.
Yeah, this is a model to symbolize the monument of liberation.
And the other thing that I also found quite wonderful about this is, of course, that it's not afraid of speaking about emotions, which is something that in the contemporary art world we're very afraid of sometimes. We don't like talking about emotions, we marginalize them. And it's also very playful. And that's another thing we're also a little bit afraid of in the contemporary art world, playing. So this was a great discovery for me, and I want to thank Barnabas for opening a gallery. I've already advertised this work to several people, so
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Isabelle van den Eynde was one of the very first galleries to open in Dubai, so in the United Arab Emirates. She started with a roster of Iranian artists and then quickly started to support regional Emirati artists. She represents, sadly due to his passing last year, she now represents the estate of Hassan Sharif, who you may have heard of. Hassan Sharif will have a major retrospective here in OGR next year. Also had a magnificent show a few months ago at the Sharjah Arts Foundation, a remarkable institution in the United Arab Emirates. She also represents Mohammed Kazem, a pupil of Sharif and an Emirati artist. She has a brilliant roster. What we are discovering here today is and this is the gallery director Jonathan, is an artist collective. And Ramin, Rokni and Hessam, two of them are brothers, and the third is a friend. These artists live together, they work together. They're based in Dubai because they were practicing artists in Iran, and during a trip to Dubai they found out that because of their art and their political commentary in their art, as you can see there's a lot of political commentary. They will be looking at current affairs, but they have a great discipline in their production of work. So there is a time to wake up, there is a time to discuss a film daily, there is a time for painting practice or creativity, and they also involve and invite constantly into their practice friends and artisans around them. So a beautiful, really collaborative effort that goes around. And
so this film is called From Sea to Dawn, and it tracks the journey of the migrants from North Africa into Europe. It's actually a rotoscopy. So this is actually about a few thousand images that are actually stitched together. The artists have animated, drawn on them, collaged elements as well. Then they're stitched together to make this film. And actually the artists refer to this as a moving painting because they see it as such. So there's various different elements that tracks the journey, of these migrants. And of course there's always political, social commentary kind of undercurrent throughout their practice. So these are things that we see coming through various different types of work. So
I think maybe briefly to mention this recent series, they are cut out from newspapers with current affairs, and these are from 2017, 2018, and very playfully, but if you look with an infinite amount of details and commentary, these take a situation, and here there is a high-ranking American politician with the Pope, if you come in, you will immediately see. Do come up close. A universe of animals, creatures, and patterns. Visiting their home, which is also their studio, is literally like walking into a picture like this, and it's extraordinary how they're able to live, breathe their art constantly and create from there. So these are actually painted on primed paper.
So we have the Trump meeting Pope here. Of course, it really touches upon the surreal with these artists. They're sort of interested in dehumanizing and degrading the subjectivity of the actual broadcast. these news feeds that we're sort of met with every single day in this hyper-consumerist society.
Just to complete, obviously we see the parallels between their situation as forced to leave their home country in Iran. Just to also add, whilst they work as a collective, they also allow themselves to have their own practice. And this series is actually only Rokni Heratzadeh on his own making this work, and the others are collective works. So
now that we finally met, and we have a bright future ahead of us.
I think so. Maybe a YouTube channel or something. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.